It is the 7th of August, and this day in Baptist history, our reading is a humble beginning and an honorable end. Our passage of Scripture is 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 27. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. John Hillsman, a native of Virginia, though but a youth, was a gallant soldier of the Revolutionary War. He saw Cornwallis surrender at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, and heard George Washington deliver his farewell address. Following the war, he went with a company of his friends to Middle Tennessee. For a time he resided at Bledsoe's Fort and taught school in the village of Cumberland, which developed into the city of Nashville. Around the year 1793, Hillsman returned to East Tennessee, where he entered the mercantile business and built the first dwelling house on the ground where the present city of Knoxville stands. The state of Tennessee was not yet in existence. The Cherokee and Creeks were a terror, and killing and horse stealing were an everyday business. It was not until August of 1825 that the first baptism ever witnessed in the city of Knoxville took place. 3,000 people watched as John Rogers, a pioneer Baptist preacher, led John Hillsman down into the waters of the Tennessee River and baptized him. His son Matthew certainly was one of the multitude of witnesses, having been born again August 7, 1814. It was later that Matthew made his profession of faith and was baptized by Elder Sam Love at the age of 19. Elder Love recommended that the Third Creek Church in their April meeting of 1833 give Brother Matthew Hillsman a license to exercise a public gift in preaching, prayer, and exhortation in any of the sister churches. This was approved by the church. He was granted a letter of dismissal, and on June 7, 1835, he was ordained by Bethel Church, Anderson County. Matthew received some education at East Tennessee College, now the University of Tennessee. For the most part, he was self-taught, living in an atmosphere of education. He was a painstaking student who became a classical scholar. After his marriage to Anne Eliza Minot, who became the mother of his 8 children, he spent 1 year working on the farm and preaching as he had opportunity. In the fall of 1835, he went to Talladega, Alabama, where he spent 18 months, exhorting and preaching to the struggling Baptists there. In 1837, he returned to Ross's Landing, now Chattanooga. After entering into a mercantile business in order to get rich, he soon learned that God had not called him to be a rich merchant. And I quote, "The Indians and white men around who had more credit than cash or honesty got the goods while the merchant got the experience." End of quote. While in Chattanooga, he helped plant the seeds that after a long period of time became the first Baptist church. Hillsman wrote in the Baptist and Reflector in 1880 concerning the planting of this church, which gives us some insight as to how some of these early churches were planted on the frontier of our country. And I quote, "The citizens had built a good-sized log schoolhouse, and occasionally visiting ministers would occupy it as a preaching place. Although I had been preaching for 3 or 4 years, I had not come to Chattanooga to engage in ministerial work, but like others to engage in a secular business. No Baptist preacher in East Tennessee at that time, so far as I know, received anything for preaching or ever expected to. With the Baptist preachers of that day, the first thing to do was to make a living, and then preach all he could. After the people found out that I was a young Baptist preacher, they requested that I should preach for them on Sundays, when no one else had an appointment, which I did for 2 or 3 years with a good deal of regularity." End of quote. A Dr. Howe came from the First Baptist Church of Nashville and organized the church, putting a young newly ordained pastor in charge of it. And I quote again, "Following the organization, Dr. Howe preached some strong sermons concerning the subjects and the act of baptism, which excited an interest and drew the crowds and also the fire of the other denominations." End of quote. Elder Hillsman pastored churches in Middle Tennessee in the 1840s and 1850s. During his pastorate in Murfreesboro, the church sent out 3 missionaries into the foreign field. He edited the Baptist Watchman of East Tennessee. He was also elected president and professor of logic, rhetoric, and moral science of Massey Creek College. One of his associate professors said of him, and I quote, "Dr. Hillsman was the finest reader of the scriptures I ever heard. His chapel lessons were scripture readings, generally from Proverbs, with a word of comment, and every reading was equal to a sermon." End of quote. Hillsman was involved in every facet of the educational and missions ministry of the Baptists in the South. One has testified, and I quote, "As a preacher, he was sound in doctrine, clear in exposition, and entirely free from sensationalism. His style was plain, practical, and direct, his best efforts being those of his regular services." End of quote. A judge of the Tennessee Supreme Court said of him, "I know no preacher whom I would prefer to hear Sunday after Sunday, year after year." He had a mind of quick discernment. He was discriminating and logical and had the ability to make one see things as he saw them. His ministry began very humbly. The first pay he ever received for preaching was a bag of flour and a dressed hog. Much later, in recognition of his scholarship and ability, Union University conferred upon him the merited title of Doctor of Divinity. Matthew Hillsman served his generation by the will of God as a preacher of righteousness and a soldier of the cross for nearly 60 years. He laid his armor aside and departed to be with Christ on October 2nd, 1892. In his latter years, he carried out his ministry in West Tennessee, where he preached 2 Sundays a month in Trenton, one in Poplar Grove and one in Hickory Grove. During this time, he was appointed postmaster of Trenton under the first administration of President Grover Cleveland. This was a testimony to the high esteem and public confidence of his fellow citizens. May we, as we persevere in the faith through every trial and spiritual battle, and use the resources and opportunities made available to us in our generation. To God be the glory.